If you were a kid in the 2000s, one toy was significantly cooler than all the rest.
To buy PlayStation 2.
PlayStation 2. PlayStation 2.
PlayStation 2.
PlayStation 2. PlayStation 2.
On the first day it was released, despite only being sold in Japan, the PlayStation 2 sold over $250 million worth of consoles, games, and accessories. The first wave of production, a total of 1.4 million units, would sell out in under a month, with retailers struggling to keep any units in stock. By the end of its life, Sony would go on to sell 155.7 million PlayStation 2s, making it the highest selling console of all time to this day, and helping cement Sony as the global leader in the video game industry. This almost wasn't the case though. Over a nearly 2-decade-long stretch in the 2000s, decisions Sony made with regards to the features it included in its consoles had lasting repercussions on institutions as far-reaching as the United States Air Force to the Iraqi government, from federal courtrooms to YouTube diss tracks. Over time, in Sony's pursuit to maximize profits, there were fears that the company's technology would be used for anything from building supercomputers to aiding terroristic governments develop missile programs. The late 90s and early 2000s saw a rapid increase in consoles' performance and image quality. While recent console generations have seen only incremental improvements in graphics, 5th generation consoles saw the transition from 2D to 3D, while the 6th generation were powerful enough for 3D to look good. While this improved hardware was clearly beneficial for developers and consumers alike, it also opened the door for potential abuses. There's a long history of fear that technology will be misused by rival governments. Going back to the 80s, home computers were becoming more common. An early model that proved popular was the ZX81, created by Sinclair Research out of Dundee, Scotland. The unit would be so popular that it ended up being sold at UK airports at duty-free shops. This allowed them to be sold and then immediately taken out of the country. Doing this became popular with visitors from the Soviet Union, allowing Western technology to make its way behind the Iron Curtain. This was especially troubling to the UK's government, leading the ZX81 to be banned from being sold in airports on the grounds of protecting national security. Similarly, the Japanese government was worried that the PlayStation 2 had become so powerful it could be repurposed to aid in warfare. Specifically, the console's GPU and memory cards were flagged as dangerous. The GPU allowed the console to quickly process high-quality images, while the memory card's encryption technology allowed it to read and interpret external data. Both of these features are crucial elements of a missile guidance system. While operating a missile guidance system, a camera is typically fitted onto a missile which relays images to a remote operator. The operator then uses this video feed to navigate the missile towards its intended target. Due to the incredible speed missiles travel at, the images need to render in an instant, otherwise the operator will not be able to tell where the missile is heading. Because of the PlayStation 2's potential to perform this task, Japan's Ministry of International Trade and Industry designated the console and memory cards as general-purpose products related to conventional weapons. Under the nation's foreign exchange and trade law, exports of more than 50,000 yen, or roughly $472, worth of products were subject to restrictions and required an official license for sale. PlayStation 2s retailed for 39,800 yen, meaning that in order for Sony to ship even 2 PlayStation 2s outside of Japan, obtaining this license was critical. Failure to do so carried a maximum punishment of 5 years in prison, or an $18,900 fine. Given that the PS2 launched in the United States with the price of $299, the margins simply weren't there to ignore the fine. This restriction came at a time where Japan was increasingly worried that its civilian products would be misused by foreign nations. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, there was hope in Western-aligned nations that this is emblematic of the end of history and that soon, all nations would be liberal democracies with massive incentives to engage in free market trade and not engage in warfare. This view was quickly challenged. On December 16, 1998, a miniature submarine that looked like it was from a James Bond movie was spotted near South Korea's Yeosu Peninsula, which is close to the country's southern tip. The vehicle was soon identified as North Korean, and South Korean vessels began to pursue the submarine, eventually chasing it near Japanese waters. With no weapons attached to the submarine, it seemed clear that the pursuit would draw to a close quickly. Rather than surrendering peacefully though, the North Koreans began to open fire using machine guns that the crew had on board. In response, the South Koreans opened fire on the vehicle, sending it sinking to the ocean floor. When the submarine was located and salvaged, it was found that the North Koreans had been using Japanese-made radars and communication equipment that had been intended for civilian use. This set off red flags about misappropriation of Japanese goods that still felt to this day. Japan's Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry continues to release updates on security export control. One from January of 2021 provides examples of how civilian technologies can be used in the military sphere. For instance, carbon fiber is a versatile, lightweight metal that is frequently used in golf clubs and fishing rods, but can also be used to make fighter jet wings. Active control suspensions are used in cars to dampen vibration by adapting suspension characteristics, which naturally lends itself to use in armored vehicle combat. And of course, gallium nitride semiconductors are commonly used by civilians to amplify a satellite's radio wave transmission, but can also be adapted in radars for fleet escort vessels. With this tight crackdown in place, it was necessary for Sony to apply for a special permit to be able to export the PlayStation 2 in bulk. Failure to do so would result in non-Japanese consumers being virtually barred from access to the console. Eventually, the government would approve the permit, but not without blacklisting several countries. The Japanese government prohibited exportation of the console to Libya, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea on the grounds that these nations were most likely to misuse the console for military purposes. Surprisingly though, this isn't where the story ends. WorldNet Daily is a far-right conspiracy website run by Joseph Farah. It's notorious for its promulgation of conspiracy theories, including being among the foremost proponents of birtherism, or the belief that Barack Obama was not born in the United States. Among other things, the site is also labeled an anti-government extremist group by the Southern Poverty Law Center. On December 19, 2000, a story appeared on WorldNet Daily. Despite Japan's ban on PlayStation 2s entering Iraq, a shipment of 4,000 had been purchased in the United States, then subsequently reshipped to Iraq. This led to speculation over what Iraq could possibly do with 4,000 PlayStation 2s. Farah proposed that the consoles were brought in by Saddam Hussein to create a makeshift supercomputer. According to one expert, an integrated bundle of 12 to 15 PlayStations could provide enough computer power to control an Iraqi unmanned aerial vehicle, which could be used in chemical weapon attacks. This was to be done using PlayStation 2s instead of traditional computers due to UN sanctions that were placed on Iraq. The United Nations prohibited countries from selling any computers to Iraq. However, since the PlayStation was categorized as a toy instead of a computer, it functioned as a workaround to the sanctions. There was just one issue with this plan: it wasn't feasible. While the PlayStation 2 did have the ability to be used as a computer, the ability to link the processors of multiple units to function as a single computer was not readily accessible upon unboxing. However, while it wasn't realistic initially, this wouldn't be the case for long. In May of 2001, Sony made an announcement that it was beta testing releasing Linux for PlayStation 2. Linux is an open source operating system that's frequently used on anything from computers to playing Doom on a single Lego brick. Initially, the beta was only made available to Japanese consumers. Once the product proved successful, an international release rolled out in early 2002 before eventually selling out the entirety of the stock allocated for the United States by 2003. The public having access to this software opened the door to endless possibilities. Linux for PlayStation 2 allows programmers to directly access the vector units in the PlayStation's CPU. This increased functionality to the PlayStation's hardware capabilities caught the attention of the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, located at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. Given the unique processor that the PlayStation 2 contains, researchers hypothesized that creating a cluster of consoles could be powerful enough to be used for scientific computation. The researchers ended up creating a supercomputer out of 70 PlayStation 2s running as a cluster using an Ethernet network. The computer was capable of performing 500 billion operations a second, which was well within the parameters of being a supercomputer in the mid-2000s. The project was shocking in part due to how simple it was to assemble. According to a New York Times article on the computer, the only hardware engineering involved was placing 70 of the individual game machines in a rack and plugging them together with a high-speed Hewlett-Packard network switch. While the computer was not considered to be one of the fastest computers at that point, it was one of the most price-efficient. The total cost of assembly was slightly more than $50,000. For context, Cray Research began selling the Cray T3E in 1995. The unit would prove to be among the most successful supercomputers on the market, with Cray Research selling $750 million worth of product. When new, the computer sold for about $3 million. When one went up for sale in 2005, the seller was still looking for $350,000 for the computer. This was 7 times more expensive than the PlayStation 2 cluster and was only able to perform 300 billion calculations per second, compared to the PlayStation's 500 billion. The computer was seen as so exceptional that Gordon Bell, the former Microsoft researcher and considered a giant in the computer industry, took notice. Around 15 years earlier, Bell founded the ACM Gordon Bell Prize, which rewards achievements in high-performance computing. While the PlayStation 2 cluster was not the fastest supercomputer around, Bell recommended that it enter the competition due to their potential in the best price/performance in high-performance computing category. Unfortunately though, bugs inherent to the system made the system nearly unusable, as it frequently forced reboots. To this point, there's no evidence that Iraq used PlayStations as either a supercomputer or to assist its missile program. It's very widely believed that the consoles were imported for wholly benign reasons. However, just because Iraq didn't create a war machine, that doesn't mean that another military hasn't done it. In such a quickly advancing space, the performance output of PlayStation 2s was glaringly outclassed by the mid-2000s. Luckily, 2006 would see the release of PlayStation 3. Upon release, Linux could be installed on the console, opening up the door to more supercomputing potential. It started at the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. As costs were rising and funding was dwindling, Professor Gaurav Khanna, who specialized in black hole research, was looking for an inexpensive supercomputer alternative. A student pointed him towards the PlayStation 3. Equipped with an IBM-created microprocessor, the architecture of the console was similar to what modern supercomputers were using. After a few months of coding, Khanna stitched together 176 PlayStation 3s and created a console strong enough to simulate complex black hole simulations. This concept caught the attention of a slightly bigger group, the United States Air Force. In 2010, the Air Force assembled a supercomputer made out of 1,760 PlayStation 3s. Known as the Condor cluster, the computer was capable of performing 500 trillion calculations per second, which, for those keeping track, is 1,000 times more powerful than the PlayStation 2 cluster that the National Center for Supercomputing Applications had created. At the time, the Condor cluster was considered the 33rd strongest computer in the world and was used by the Air Force for radar enhancements, pattern recognition, satellite imagery processing, and artificial intelligence research. Even more impressive was the efficiency of the system. The Air Force paid around $400 for each of the PlayStation 3s, or just over $700,000. For comparable computer parts, it would have been a per unit price of nearly $10,000. All in, the Condor cluster was estimated to have cost around $2 million. This is a fraction of what an equivalent computer would have cost had it been built from off-the-shelf parts, with the Air Force Research Laboratory's Director of High-Power Computing, Mark Barnell, estimating that the cluster cost only between 5 and 10%, meaning the Air Force saved between 8 and 18 million off a computer which otherwise would have cost between $10 and $20 million. The Condor cluster also had the added bonus of being significantly more energy efficient, consuming only 10% of the power for similar supercomputers. With these impressive results, it seemed like the age of console supercomputers was just beginning. Instead though, this was the beginning of the end. Even the Condor cluster nearly didn't happen. For years, Sony had touted the PlayStation 3 as unhackable. This claim would come to an end in January of 2010 when George Hotz found a way in. George, also known as GeoHot, was already an accomplished hacker by this point, having been one of the first people to jailbreak the iPhone. Over the course of 5 weeks, Hotz found a way into the console and posted about it to his blog. Immediately, this created a widespread ripple effect, creating a web of broken promises, lawsuits, and at least one diss track. To start, the way George was able to hack the PS3 was by taking advantage of a feature that was built into early models of the console. OtherOS allowed users to run other operating systems on their PlayStation, including Linux. When in this mode, the user was locked out from accessing the entire console due to it running as a virtual machine. While this decreased the performance potential of the system, it was intended to increase security. Hotz was able to find an exploit in this feature that allowed him to gain full control over the console. This allowed users to pirate games, which was especially problematic for Sony. Games and accessories are how the company makes money. When the PlayStation 3 launched, it's estimated that the console cost between $800 and $840 for Sony to produce. Despite this initial investment, Sony priced the console at $499 to $599, depending on hard drive space. It's estimated that between 2007 and 2008, Sony lost over $3 billion on console sales. This loss was made up for when consumers buy additional products, as Sony's margin on these is much larger. With so much hinging on the security of the system, even prior to the release of the PlayStation 3, concerns were raised over the safety of making alternate operating systems so readily available. This naturally raises the question as to why Sony included the feature. If you want to believe Phil Harrison, the former president of Sony Computer Entertainment Worldwide Studios, the goal was to encourage developers to use the systems as a way to learn skills using real hardware. The hope was that the PlayStation 3 could serve as a 21st century equivalent to the Commodore 64, a now legendary computer from the 1980s which served as many developers' first foray into computer science fields. By lowering the barrier to entry, Sony argued that a new development renaissance could be the result. While this rose-tinted view is certainly sunny, it likely isn't the case. Much like Japan limits exports on its technology, many countries place tariffs on imported goods. In the European Union, when the PlayStation 3 was released, a tariff of 2.75% was placed on video game consoles. However, because the PS3 could run operating systems like Linux, Sony successfully had the system categorized as an automatic data processing machine. Since computers did not have an import tariff placed on them, Sony was able to dodge this tax, saving a significant sum of money. However, by 2009, Sony was already phasing out OtherOS with the release of the PS3 Slim. Sony claimed that the goal of the Slim console was to provide consumers with a lower cost option, and that the cost of including OtherOS was incompatible with providing these savings. Despite this, they stated that they were committed to continue supporting the feature on existing consoles. While this may have been their intention in 2009, 2010 showed they had a change of perspective. After GeoHot's successful hack, Sony acted quickly to rectify the issue. On April 1st, 2010, Sony released System Firmware Update 3.21. The update completely removed the ability to download OtherOS, even on systems which were compatible with the program. Consoles which already had the software downloaded would retain access to it, but would be significantly limited in their access to the PlayStation's other features, including online servers. This was only the tip of the iceberg though. In response to Sony's update, GeoHot took it into his own hands to restore access to OtherOS. Within a week, HOTS had found a workaround and OtherOS was again accessible. While this looked like the beginning of a game of cat and mouse, this is when Sony upped the ante. On January 11, 2011, Sony filed a complaint against George Hotz in the United States District Court for the Northern District of California. The complaint alleged that Hotz violated the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, has contributory copyright infringement arising out of the Copyright Act, as well as related state and common law claims for violation of California Comprehensive Computer Data Access and Fraud Act, breach of contract, tortious interference with contractual relations, trespass, and common law misappropriation. If found liable on all counts, Hotz would be on the hook for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in damages. As one would expect when facing such serious allegations, GeoHot took his time crafting his response, which arrived a month later on February 12th.
Yo, it's GeoHot! And for those that don't know, I'm getting sued by Sony. Let's take us out of the courtroom and into the streets. I'm a beast, at the least you'll face me in the Northeast. Get my ire up, light my fire up.
Unfortunately, the rap was never shown in court due to the case never reaching trial. The party settled out of court on April 9th, with an injunction being agreed to that prevented Hotz from misusing any Sony product in the future, with any violations requiring $10,000 in damages to be paid to Sony. While this was where George's time in court ended, Sony still had more trials to attend to, except now, they were the defendant. In response to the removal of OtherOS, consumers began filing lawsuits, alleging that Sony had unjustly enriched themselves by selling consumers a product which was no longer capable of performing its advertised purpose. Since Sony had advertised the PlayStation 3 as a device that can be used to play games, watch movies, view photos, listen to music, and run a full-featured Linux operating system that transforms your PS3 into a home computer, the claim alleged that removing the ability to use Linux on the console was a breach of express warranty, as well as a breach of implied warranty, violates the Magnuson-Moss Warranty Act, which provides a federal private right of action for state law warranty claims, as well as serving as unjust enrichment, conversion, in addition to violations of both the Unfair Competition Law and the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. It was agreed that Sony would pay $65 to anyone who purchased a fat PS3 in the United States between November 1st, 2006 and April 1st, 2010, that either used or knew of the OtherOS functionality, or otherwise believes that they lost value as a result of Update 3.21. The total settlement was for $3.75 million, with an estimated 10 million consumers having been eligible for payout. Somehow though, even as the trial was winding down, Sony gave consumers one last sucker punch. Despite the agreed settlement being for $65 per consumer, the structure of the deal allowed this number to vary based on how many people made a claim. In the end, people only received $10.07 from Sony. This long, strange trip all leads back to the Air Force though. Since the release of the PS3 Slim, Sony was slowly removing the original PS3 from stores. Additionally, due to Sony patching out the ability to use Linux on updated consoles, viable second-hand consoles were increasingly difficult for the Air Force to find, as the owner needed to not download the update. Between rolling out the PS3 Slims and console updates, the project nearly didn't occur. However, the Air Force was able to strike a deal with Sony. While Sony had been pulling the fat PlayStations from store shelves, they didn't dispose of them. Instead, these unsold consoles were simply put into storage. The project was saved when Sony agreed to sell the Air Force a warehouse full of consoles that had been sitting in the suburbs of Chicago. In the end, the Condor cluster was both the peak and is likely the end of consoles being used for supercomputing and war machines. Since PlayStations are typically sold at a loss, every time a console is sold for which no games or other accessories are purchased, Sony loses money. While this doesn't make much of a difference for any individual system, if it became the norm to build up supercomputers out of hundreds or thousands of PlayStations, it would quickly add up. For instance, even assuming the Air Force only used the models where Sony lost less money, the 1,760 consoles they bought resulted in a net loss of over $420,000 for Sony. While the early 2000s saw Sony try to justify this potential loss through maximizing tax breaks, the inherent risk increased accessibility provides to the overall security of the system is not worth the costs. The journey Sony took to becoming the largest video game company in the world is far from a straight shot. The decisions it made had, at times, caused great fear, and had the potential to do much worse if these fears had been proven true. While Saddam Hussein never used PlayStation 2s for launching missiles, it's worth remembering that the same toy a child unwrapped for Christmas was still militarized by the United States Air Force. If you made it this far into the video, please consider subscribing. Making these videos takes a lot of time and research, but seeing the support makes it all worth it. Regardless, thanks for watching, and see you next time.